Hello everyone, I'm going to share my theories on WestWorld. I believe I have a story that tells you the world that WestWorld exists in, thereby giving the context for all that you see in Season 1. I have written this out in story form and posted it on a blog and on Reddit, where I have received some questions and I answered them on my blog, and will use that as a place I will post questions and answers so it can be updated regularly. I apologize I am not better at making videos. I hope to get better software soon and produce better product. I also want to warn you of spoilers, so do not continue if you haven't watched all 10 episodes of Season 1. There is also the possibility that I am correct in my theory, and I just removed all mystery and ruined the whole thing. Let me share a comment from Reddit. Holy crap, I loved it, but I'm also a bit bummed. It reads like such a solid theory, I now feel like someone spoiled the series for me before I had a chance to watch all episodes. That being said, WestWorld Universe explained, all the backstory you didn't see. Ford and Arnold are essentially based on Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. They are two geniuses who found each other in their youth and shared an interest. Arnold is Wozniak, Ford is Jobs. They had created an artificial intelligence that got them great attention. They needed funding, and that's when they met Logan. Logan has a father who is super rich and was willing to help them form a company, Delos. The three men become very wealthy as their AI is incorporated in technologies around the world. All three men live their lives of wealth, and Ford and Arnold do their day jobs at Delos. Logan grows bored with his life, and he introduces Ford and Arnold to the concept of Future World, a place where people can be who they want to be in pure luxury and fun. Ford had already been moving in the direction of artificial bodies and brains to accompany the intelligence that Arnold had created. So they started planning and creating the desert complex for Future World. At the point that Future World opened, the host didn't need to be very intelligent. The whole experience was not that far removed from a World's Fair or Expo from the 1930s in concept. People essentially were put in a world of tomorrow where all the hosts were beautiful and they got to have sex with them while experiencing cutting-edge technology. At this point, two things happened. Arnold began arguing over the morality of what this whole thing had turned into, and they started to notice hosts engaging in forms of self-protection they hadn't programmed into them. Those things were the catalyst for great change for the three of them. Logan was caught up in how Future World was losing gravitas in the public mind because it had morphed into a corporate-sponsored world of sex and materialism. Ford and Arnold obsessed on the newfound life in the hosts. The one thing they shared was the need to expand and grow the area of the world of the hosts, though for different reasons. Future World was constantly being adjusted, and they began work on Roman World. Roman World was conceived to remove the modern materialism while keeping the sex for those who wanted it, but still maintaining areas of learning and family interactions. Roman World was also the first time they started purposefully providing and exploring the violence that had appeared in Future World, with gladiators, slaves, and small army skirmishes. The goals of Ford and Arnold are to evolve the hosts. Roman World was created as a simple world with very little complexity programmed into it. The hosts are meant to explore and develop the early stages of their senses and higher-level thinking in this world. At this point, there is an event in the outside world. A great man-made pandemic strikes the world. They all lose friends and family. Perhaps Ford loses a wife and children. This is when Arnold loses his son. This is the catalyst for all that is to come. This is when a defining realization occurs in Arnold and Ford. Mankind will not survive this plague. They devise a plan to transfer the minds of people into the hosts. Humanity will only continue in a new form. The problem is the hosts are still too rudimentary. They must evolve the host to a level of complexity found in humans if they are to be imprinted and hold that complexity. Both Ford and Arnold take on the role of gods. They accelerate all their plans for expansion and start building WestWorld, as well as several other worlds. This is when they had to seek more funding and realized they had to go public. Because of Logan's increasingly bizarre behaviors, his father took control of his shares at this point, sadly. WestWorld will be the next level of complexity for the host development. They work tirelessly and make great advances in all areas of host development. There are great leaps with the hardware of the hosts, including the capacity and complexity of their minds. With this new complexity in place, they were ready to develop Arnold's subconscious AI and hardware and attempt to implement it in the new WestWorld hosts. One day Ford's father visits and the two of them show him around and have a picture taken to commemorate the occasion. While speaking with him about the deaths and suffering they have all endured, and observing his callous manner towards his son in face of his son's great success, that both Arnold and Ford realize when people suffer, they get motivated. They must suffer to grow. This is when both Dolores and the maze are created. The maze being the tool by which the new subconscious is integrated into the host being as a whole. More hosts are presented with the maze. They were denoted by the maze Arnold had tattooed on the underside of their scalp, in hopes of some of them integrating the new AI and hardware. Another complexity entered their model they hadn't anticipated: the consistently abusive behavior of the guests that they would be subjected to. Arnold, always naive to the sins of others that aren't present in him, and this is from a small handful of corporate beta testers. But it harkens back to the early detection of self-protecting behaviors seen in Future World. Hosts were anticipating the cruelest of evils and starting to flee the area. They were not allowed to hurt the guests even in self-defense, so they would literally run through walls and other anomalous tactics. Ford realized it was the nature of artificial memory. It is highly compartmentalized, and each compartment is written and rewritten hundreds of times, eventually creating echoes. They decided to use this to their advantage. They already knew from their own lives that suffering motivates, so they reinforced what was organically happening in WestWorld already, which was the further the guests got from the town of Sweetwater, their behaviors got more fringed to suit. And all they had to do that was expand the physical park and put a war in its outer realm. Then they placed the hosts that were there for the maze either physically in the outer realms or in a narrative that takes them there. Let's use Maeve as an example of how this works. Maeve is an educated woman who lives with her husband and daughter on a homestead in the outer world. Sometimes Dolores would bring guests out to their homestead, and you would experience a very loving and happy family, sans any race issues, even though the Civil War is going on 2 sectors over, and they face racism in the town when they get supplies. Maeve and her family are very happy living their ideal lives. But one out of every so many guests that made it to their homestead realize there are no prying eyes out there on the outer fringe of the park, and Maeve is very beautiful. Horrible things would happen to her and her whole family regularly, and Maeve was remembering and getting motivated to change the nature of her existence. It was less than a year past the great expansion of the park that more defining events took place. Logan continued to self-destruct and lost more favor with his father. William was the catalyst, and his unique level of evil also accelerated the evolution of the maze-inducted hosts. But Ford and Arnold hated him and did manipulative and cruel things to him in their world of which he is still unaware. The second was Dolores solved the maze. It didn't have the full effect Arnold had anticipated, but there was integration. And that brings us to the third thing, the argument between Ford and Arnold. When and why do we stop being gods and let them find their own path to the complexity we need? Asked Arnold. When they prove to me they are human, said Ford. But are they more? It doesn't matter. They will be human at some point. That is the purpose of their existence. If we stop controlling their evolution just when they are taking their first steps, they will evolve into something else. We didn't create them to be something else. We created them to be the human race. Arnold conceded and things continued mostly as they had, except for one important thing. Arnold's empathy could no longer withstand the end of the maze, knowing he would just roll them back and make them endure it again and again. This is when Arnold devises his plan. He eventually uploads the data he believes is himself to the main computer and leaves an explanation for Ford on his desk. He then goes and meets Dolores at the end of the maze. Ford is further isolated and alone. He knows the hosts aren't advanced enough to imprint Arnold on one, so he continues to work on the hardware and opens WestWorld with great fanfare, always preparing for his friend's return. A big part of that preparation is working on the other parks as well. Both Roman World and Future World are upgraded with the advanced narrative and hosts, with Samurai World and others being created as well. Ford and Arnold had spun their host evolution narrative throughout all worlds and all systems. Ford gathers some key allies and shares the truth with them, and together they continue the master plan. Nobody can know the master plan and what they have done, or else it would be corrupted by greed and emotion. Ford picks his two top engineers, Felix and Sylvester, and they assist with a modified version of Arnold's plan. First, they create the most advanced host body to date and hope it will be able to hold the imprint of Arnold's being. When they do the transfer, they at first think they have had success, but quickly realize the host also has no empathy. At that point, Ford realized that would be the signal he has had success with Arnold. It would be his innate sense of empathy. He also realized his theories about suffering being the motivator for growth were true, and he also could no longer bear the strain of it. While still trying to fine-tune Bernard into Arnold, he had a Ford host created and transferred a copy of his mind into it. It, of course, did not have empathy and would be relentless and methodical in its ways. The Ford host could be used as a puppet by Ford if needed. At first it was a little clumsy, and Felix and Sylvester had to help him fine-tune his controls. But for the most part, the host, Ford, could handle all the duties and expectations that are thrown at him, although the real Ford would often take control during important events. Having the host body gave him the ability to have transmitters so he could communicate with other hosts without the verbal commands or any other visible means. The concept of the host being a surrogate for humans who are suffering from the pandemic is not new. Although the original reason to build the Delos compound far from any population was the fear of its power generators, but they were able to use that to their advantage. They built extensive Hyperloop systems, bringing clients in from all over the United States. But when Ford and Arnold realized the convoluted task before them of creating a truly compatible host, they created an industrial, finger quotes, accident in the lower levels that once were the transportation, welcoming center, and lobby of Future World. Then it was claimed to be uninhabitable for many years, so they had to build a new, much smaller rail system essentially at the surface level that only connects to the larger transportation system some 20 miles out. That way it was much more isolated, and they could control security much better. Ford and Bernard took over the now uninhabited lower levels and created their secret offices and labs, as well as the cold storage for maze runners. The peoples of the world have been clamoring for even artificial organs, but Ford and Arnold tried to refuse. But William was eventually able to manipulate them into releasing a few organs through a non-profit organization he created. They had desperately wanted to control the paths of evolution for their hosts, and even an organ could lead others to the accelerated path that leads to futures they had already rejected. Another reason for Ford to despise William. That pretty much gets us to Season 1. You can see the factions at play. Members of the board are essentially trying to do the same thing Ford and Arnold are doing, for reasons bigger than greed, so can you really blame them? And William is still confused as to why he is so blessed, but looking to the external, not the internal. In the last episodes, we saw certain sought-after events took place. Dolores got her voice, and Arnold got his empathy. Those two things triggered Ford and Arnold's next phase of the evolution narrative, that including waking up Maeve and others, then putting them on their path to the next phase of their evolution. I was going to leave it at that, but I decided to continue on and speculate even further. In Season 2, Maeve will enter both Future World and Samurai World. In Samurai World, she knows she's in the WestWorld worlds, but in Future World, she thinks she's in the real world. So the first episode of Season 2, in the Maeve storyline, we will see her essentially move through the train station in Future World, which is now shut down for security reasons like all parks, which means, yes, every time she was in the finger quotes real world, she was actually in a section of Future World that is only used by Ford and the evolution narrative. Whenever we see someone like Teresa Colin in that area, it is because she is subject to Ford's whims as to where he sets up his mini shops. He is also pretty lax about who does what to host there. Teresa, not so much. This leads to Maeve finding the doorway to Samurai World with a big climactic effect of being faced with an entirely new other world as the closing shot, possibly with Mount Fuji in the background, a huge, dramatic scene. Or, more likely, bam, it's Roman World, because HBO still has sets and costumes sitting around somewhere. And no, she does not have free will. She is under control of the evolution narrative. And that's where I will leave it for now.